Administration will not send more troops into Iraq to, as the president has put it, take the oil.
I'm not going to talk about what we may or may not do. I think the president's been very clear that he doesn't telegraph forward what taking options off the table. That's not a good negotiating skill.
Various sections where they have the oil. They have, people don't know this about Iraq, but they have among the largest oil reserves in the world, in the entire world. And we're the only ones. We go in, we spend $3 trillion, we lose thousands and thousands of lives, and then, Matt, what happens is we get nothing. You know, it used to be to the victor belong the spoils. Now, there was no victor there, believe me, there was no victor. But I always said, take the oil. One of the benefits we would have had if we took the oil is ISIS would not have been able to take oil and use that oil to fuel themselves.
Let's go to our military folks and Chairman Rogers. General Hertling, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. This is the thing that Donald Trump has said from the beginning, take the oil. I cannot wrap my mind around the concept just from a military standpoint, because all I see is you're taking the oil of a sovereign nation, which is our ally, under this antiquated notion of to the victor goes the spoils. They're supposedly our ally, and for the percentage of the country that doesn't hate us already, wouldn't that turn everybody else against the United States if we are stealing Iraq's oil?
Well, not if we were in the 16th century, Anderson, but unfortunately we're not. We're in the 21st. And yeah, I've heard Mr. Trump say that. It's on a long list of things that I've heard him say about what the military can and can't do. Having been in northern Iraq, where a good portion of the oil is for almost 2 years, I can tell you I can't wrap my head around it either. So I'm glad he, as a businessman, knows how to do that. I can't figure it out. If it's bringing other corporations in, continuing to pump, while the 19 million Iraqis continue to live and allow us to do that, that'd be great. But it's just really hard to do.
Chairman Rogers, I mean, what Trump has said to me in interviews early on was bring in U.S. oil companies, Chevron, others, surround them while they steal the oil, surround them with troops. I mean, does that make any sense to you militarily, strategically, diplomatically?
Hey, look at the time, Anderson. Let me get philosophical about this for a moment.
Really? How about those? We got a lot of time. We can go to the 10 o'clock hour if you want.
Yeah, exactly. Just let me get philosophical for a minute. In the early sweep-up of the war, I will tell you, this was a very popular political position amongst Republicans and Democrats. In every town hall I had as a member of Congress, this was an issue. People saying, well, why don't we have them pay for it?
It's popular in bars, too, but it doesn't mean
I'm just saying, let me just get to where we were. And my explanation would probably be the same today. We do negotiate a percentage of the revenues from that oil. Matter of fact, the Saudis were committed so much oil in certain circumstances. Other countries committed certain amounts of oil in certain circumstances. So when you say take it, I never did hear him say steal it. This notion of actually physically taking it out of the ground doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But this notion that a percentage can be negotiated to cover U.S. costs, especially ground operations, unrealistic. And by the way, that actually happened during the course of the war.
But that is actually not his plan. His plan is get Chevron, get the American oil companies in, surround them with U.S. troops, and
so what you meant to say is percentage of the revenue. I think I heard you say that.
Colonel Layden, I mean, just from again, I just think of the reaction of our allies in the rest of Iraq, how they feel about us taking the oil, which is their future.
It would be a non-starter for that very reason. You know, what you want to do is you want to build up countries like Iraq, where what comes after ISIS in the case of Syria and northern Iraq. So there are going to be some significant issues with this neo-mercantilist, 16th century, 18th century, whatever century you want to pick, issue here is something that is very similar to what you might expect a Chinese military leader to say in the present day, because they seem to be developing this neo-mercantilist policy as well, but it is not workable for our particular time and the particular region that we're dealing with here. You want to raise the oil revenues of the countries that are affected by these conflicts, and you want to give them a way in which to live their lives, and that would be a sustained revenue stream that would allow them to do that, and that would be essential.
Because the idea of General Hertling of to the victor goes the spoils, it implies that Iraq itself is the enemy and we have crushed them and now we're taking their oil.
It implies more than that, Anderson. It implies that the U.S. military that's there is a mercenary force to do these kind of things. Look, there are 18 battlefield cemeteries throughout Europe from World War I and World War II. When you go to those grounds, the people who monitor those cemeteries that have U.S. soldiers in it say, this is the only place that America claims as occupied territory, the places where they buried their dead. We are not, it is not the American way of war to go and occupy a land, steal its resources, rape its women, and do the kind of things that Mr. Trump is saying. It is, again, a simplistic approach that's appealing to a certain percentage of Americans.
It's worth being really specific about this. Because it's one thing to campaign for president by saying you wish the U.S. military would have looted, would have pillaged, would have stolen resources from a country that we were occupying. It's one thing to run for office saying you wish that U.S. forces had committed, incidentally, that war crime and pillaged the countries that we became responsible for as an occupying force once we toppled their government. It's one thing to say that as a candidate, but once you are saying that as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, once you're saying, as commander-in-chief, that the U.S. military should steal the oil from countries where our military is operating, and that we might have a chance again to do that in the future. Think about what that means for U.S. troops who are on the ground right now, working with local forces in all of these countries where we haven't stolen the oil, where we've never said before that we were going to steal the oil, where there were lots of local suspicions that we might, and we had to defeat those local suspicions. And presumably those local forces would feel very strongly about us not stealing the oil. Think about what that means for U.S. forces serving in those countries abroad right now.
On a statement that the president made on Saturday, can you, and I just want to clarify your answer here, can you unequivocally state that this administration will not send more troops into Iraq to, as the president has put it, take the oil?
I'm not going to talk about what we may or may not do. I think the president's been very clear that he doesn't telegraph forward what taking options off the table. That's not a good negotiating skill. That's not how he works. There's a reason he's been successful at negotiating, is because he does it in a way that doesn't telegraph to people what he's going to take on or off the table.
Whether or not you are going to talk about what we may or may not do, the fact that that is on the table makes this actually not a hypothetical scenario anymore, because that's policy. That's now policy. The White House, the President of the United States, has just communicated to the American people and to the world that U.S. troops in oil-producing regions around the world might be there to take the oil from these countries. That very well could be why they're there. The U.S. reserves the right to do that. Borzu Dargahi is a great reporter, longtime Middle East correspondent. He's now a Middle East correspondent for BuzzFeed. After the president made his take the oil remarks this weekend at the CIA, Borzu in Iraq interviewed some militia fighters and Iraqi security officials who right now are working with U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq in the fight against ISIS, where again, U.S. forces are partnered with Iraqi forces to fight against ISIS. I mean, U.S. forces spent part of the last week blowing up dozens of boats on the Tigris River outside of Mosul to stop ISIS fighters from using those boats to get away from Mosul as Iraqi ground troops continued to clear ISIS out of Mosul. I mean, there are 5,000 plus U.S. troops in Iraq right now who are engaged in the fight against ISIS alongside Iraqi forces. Except now, the new president of the United States says the reason U.S. troops might be there is to get our hands on Iraq's oil. So Borzu Dargahi talks with Iraqi fighters to get a reaction to this, and these Iraqi fighters tell him exactly what you think they would say. They say exactly what you or I would say if we found out that some foreign country that was ostensibly here to help us was actually here to steal America's natural resources. Quote, "He cannot do it. He cannot succeed. Of course, I would fight the Americans if they came for the oil. Quote, there's no way Trump could take the oil unless he launched a new military front, and then it would be a new world war." Say these folks who are right now fighting with U.S. troops. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee tonight approved the CEO of Exxon to be America's new Secretary of State. It was a pure party line vote. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida soaked up a bunch of good press about his hypothetical courage and his hypothetical nonpartisan patriotism when he said that he might vote against the Exxon CEO to be Secretary of State because he had real concerns. But of course, naturally, Marco Rubio cast a yes vote for the Exxon CEO. The vote was a party line vote. And the Exxon CEO, Rex Tillerson, now has no barrier to being approved for that position. His vote, his nomination will pass on the floor as well. Simply putting an oil company CEO in charge of American foreign policy would be enough to make this a problem, right? It would be enough to ignite suspicions and recriminations worldwide that maybe American troops weren't there to help, that maybe American foreign policy is designed to steal oil from other countries, that the American military is being used as essentially a capitalist tool, as a looting tool, as a pillaging tool to steal the natural resources from other countries. Having an oil company CEO be in charge of our foreign policy would be enough to create those worries. But it's not worries anymore. You're not hinting at it anymore when the president just flat out says, yeah, that's our new policy, and then the White House spokesman backs it up. That was very dangerous to U.S. interests when it was a hypothetical, when it was a suspicion, when it was a conspiracy theory. But now it is U.S. policy. And the people who are going to face the threat from it are American troops who are already in harm's way in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria. Gordon Trowbridge was deputy press secretary at the Pentagon this time last week. Today, he no longer is. And today, in his personal capacity, he said this, quote, White House spokesman needed to clearly say U.S. is not going to take Iraq's oil. Every moment that statement stands puts our troops at greater risk. If you are a military family, if you have got friends in the military, if you know somebody who is deployed or is deploying, this, we're going to take your oil, that's American policy now, we're going to take your oil, that has just shifted the ground underneath your boots. Our military has incredible technology and incredible reach, and they take incredible risks. And we as taxpayers pay an incredible price for it. But we support our troops, and we respect their sacrifice, and we worry about the dangers that they face. We do not want them to face unnecessary danger. And we very rarely have to worry that the danger that they face emanates from our own government. But until they fix this, until the new administration fixes this, they have created a daily, clear, and present big new danger for every American who is serving in an oil-producing country abroad, as if their mission wasn't dangerous enough already. I'll be right back.